In this video, I will present to you Campbell's refined version of Frege's puzzle. The core way in which Campbell refines Frege's puzzle is in understanding cognitive value as inference. Now, what is inference? An important part of our rational lives is the activity of drawing inferences. For instance, on the basis of perceiving that things are thus and so, we typically form the belief that they are so. Or we combine various beliefs to form new ones, or to make decisions about how to act. So, we can say that the cognitive value of an expression or mental representation involves the inferences that it licenses. Here are some simple examples of inferences. Suppose you're a detective investigating a murder case. You see big tracks in the mud and infer that the murderer must have been wearing combat boots. So here, on the basis of you perceiving things, you infer a belief about how things are. Here is another example. It's the morning, and you think to yourself, if the weather report says that there is over 50% chance of rain, I'll bring an umbrella. Then you look at the weather report, and it says there is 70% chance of rain. So you conclude or infer, I will bring an umbrella. In this latter case, you are combining various beliefs to form new ones. Now, an inference is also the same as an argument. So when you combine various beliefs, say, together to form a new one, in an inference, you can think of that as also providing an argument for that new belief, where the premises are the beliefs that you're combining. So what does it mean to say that an inference or argument is good? In philosophy, and for the purposes of this lecture, we assume that in general a good argument is one that is deductively valid. So I assume that all of you are aware of this notion of validity. Now, Campbell proposes the following slightly different account of deductive validity. For Campbell, an argument is valid just in case the premises guarantee the truth of the conclusion and in a way that is epistemically obvious. So what's important is that Campbell is adding an additional requirement on validity. So not just that the premises deductively guarantee the truth of the conclusion, but also these premises must do so in a way that is transparent or epistemically obvious or manifest, as he says. So a good argument or inference can't just be one where the premises necessitate the conclusion. Rather, it must be one in which the premises necessitate the conclusion in a way that makes it clear to the reasoner how that is so. So now, given this account of the goodness of inferences, we can given this account of the goodness of inferences, as well as this idea of cognitive value as involving inferences, we can now give a refined version of Frege's puzzle. So, to make sense of this refined Frege's puzzle, I want you to consider the following scenarios. Okay, so for both of the scenarios, imagine there's a man, Elijah, and Elijah is trying to sleep in his cave. However, he is being bothered by a fly which is buzzing around in his cave. Now, consider the following two scenarios. First, Elijah is attending to the fly as it roams around the cave. So you could imagine, for instance, that he is lying on his back and he moves his eyes to track perceptually where the fly is going as it buzzes around. Okay? So he is using his attention to track the fly's movements around the cave above him. Now, at one point in the episode of tracking, he forms the belief he would express with the sentence, "That fly is black." So, at one point in the episode of tracking, he notices the fly's blackness. At a later point in the episode, he forms the belief he would express with the sentence, "That fly is large." So at a later point in the episode, he notices the fly's largeness. So that is one of the scenarios. Now here is another scenario. Imagine Elijah sees the fly in front of him. At this point, he forms a belief he would express with the sentence, "That fly is black." Then he stops looking at the fly. Then, a bit later on, having lost track of the fly, having stopped looking at it, he sees the fly again. But he does not realize that it is the same fly as he saw earlier. And at this later time, he forms the belief he would express with the sentence, "That fly is large." So these are two similar scenarios. However, the important difference is that between the time that Elijah has formed these two different beliefs, in the first case, he has been tracking the same fly as it roams around the cave. In the second case, however, Elijah has not been tracking this fly. He loses sight of it. And when he sees the fly again, he doesn't realize it's the same fly before he forms the second belief. Now, I want you to observe, as a matter of intuition, that between these two cases, the following inference that Elijah could make, which we'll represent in the following way, and which I'll explain in a second, I want you to observe that in the first case, this inference seems valid. Whereas in the second case, this inference here, which I've labeled alpha, does not seem to be valid. Okay, so what is this inference? This inference has two premises. The first premise is the belief that fly is black. The second premise is the belief that fly is large. So these are two premises of the argument. And the conclusion of the argument is that there is one thing that is both black and large. So, what I want you to observe, now that I've unpacked what this inference is, in case one, when Elijah is attending to the fly throughout the period of time in which he forms both of these beliefs as premises, he is able to validly infer the conclusion that there is one thing that's both black and large, i.e., he's able to validly infer from saying that fly is black, pointing at the fly he's looking at, and then a moment later at the fly he's still looking at, saying that fly is large while pointing at it, he's able to infer validly that there's one thing that's both black and large. That, or another way of saying that is that it's the same fly. So intuitively, if you're watching something, if you're attending to something over time, it is obvious to you that it's the same thing that you're attending to over time. However, in case 2, this inference in alpha is not valid. That is because it is not obvious to Elijah that it's the same fly that he's picking out between each of these premises. Validly infer that there is one and the same thing that is both black and large. But to repeat, in case 1, it is obvious because of his attention that it is one and the same thing that is both black and large. So, in case 2, for Elijah to validly infer that there is a single fly, or a single thing that is both black and large, he would have to realize that it is the same fly he is seeing at the various times. And that realization can be represented by an additional premise of the argument. So, in case 2, this argument is valid. So again, we have the same 2 premises as in the argument alpha, but we add a third premise. And furthermore, I've added subscripts to help indicate how this third premise will work. Okay, so the first time he sees a fly, he forms the belief that that fly is black. So the 1 indicates that this, when he's talking about that fly, this is the first time he sees it. Now the second time that he sees the fly, he thinks that fly is large. And because that's the second time he says that fly, he thinks about the fly, I've subscripted the demonstrative that fly with a subscript 2. Now the realization that it is the same fly in both cases is represented by the identity premise, which says that fly seen at time 1 is that fly seen at time 2. So again, what this additional premise says is that the fly pointed out here is the same as the fly pointed out here. Now if we add this additional premise, Elijah in case 2 can validly infer that there is something that is both black and large. So the inference here I've labeled beta is valid in case 2. On the basis of these 2 cases and the intuitions about the validity of these arguments in those cases, we can argue as follows. First, to summarize what we established, the argument alpha, or the inference alpha, is a valid inference in case 1 of attention to the fly, but it's not a valid inference in case 2. Second, the meanings of the demonstratives or the singular terms that fly, which occur throughout the inferences, the meanings of those expressions must be what explain whether an inference is valid or not. So, given 1 and 2, since the referents of the demonstratives are all the same, the meaning of the demonstratives cannot be their referent. So let me unpack why let me just review why it's the case that the referents of the demonstratives are the same. So in both these cases, we're assuming it's the same fly. So in this case, it's the same fly that Elijah is tracking. In this case, it's the same fly that Elijah sees at one time and then also at a later time, despite that he doesn't realize it or hasn't been tracking that fly. So that means that all of these uses of the demonstratives, that fly, in either of these cases, 1 and 2, pick out the same object in the world. But so that means if that meaning is just that referent, then the meanings cannot explain why, in this case, this inference works. But if the meanings are just the reference, the specific fly, then the meanings, because there's no difference in the meanings, cannot explain why this inference alpha works in case 1, but does not work in case 2. So the meaning of the demonstratives is not simply the referent. So this is the conclusion, a similar conclusion to Frege's against the direct reference theory. Now, how do we motivate our notion of sense? Well, in 4 we say the following. In order for the meaning of the demonstratives to explain the validity of alpha in case 1, their meanings must determine that it's the same referent, and do so in a way that is epistemically obvious. Okay? So to return to the relevant conception of validity, the validity of an argument, or an argument is an argument is valid just in case the premises guarantee the truth of the conclusion, and they do so in an obvious way. So that first part of that account, i.e. the premises guaranteeing the truth of the conclusion, that's why the meanings of the singular terms have to determine sameness of referent, because these premises only guarantee the truth of this conclusion if that fly here and that fly here pick up the same thing. Okay? Because if they picked out different things, it's possible for there not to be anything that has both these properties of blackness and largeness. So that's to say that in order for these two premises, that fly is black and that fly is large, in order for these two things to guarantee that there's one thing that's both black and large, these two singular terms have to pick out the same object. So, in order for the meanings of the demonstratives to explain that component of validity, the meanings must determine the same referent. But, as we noted, there's an additional aspect to validity for Campbell, which is that the premises must guarantee the conclusion in a way that is epistemically obvious. And so the meanings can only determine the same referent, but have to do so in a way that is transparent or clear or manifest to the reasoner. Hence, and this is the overall conclusion, the meanings of the demonstratives are things that both determine reference and play a cognitive role. So this argument is a defense of the Phrygian idea that we saw in the review part of this lecture in the last video, that there's one and the same thing, the meaning of expressions, that both determines reference and has an epistemic component. Now, to conclude this video, here's an exercise which you can do to test your understanding of this refined version of Frege puzzle. So here's another way of generating this type of more sophisticated argument for a sense, using an example that has come up already, and perhaps is a simpler example. And this example is with the morning star and the evening star, or Hesperus and Phosphorus. Okay, so what you can, I'm going to read these sentences to you, and what you can do in your own time and possibly ask during office hours is try to think about, according to Campbell, which of these inferences is valid and which are not, and the consequences of that, or how to run a similar argument as we just saw here for sense on the basis of observing the relative validity or invalidity of the following. So the first inference has its first premise that the morning star is 5 million years old. The second premise is that the morning star is a planet. And the conclusion is that there is a 5 million year old planet. Second, there's the other argument, the following argument. Premise 1. The morning star is 5 million years old. Premise 2. The evening star is a planet. So, conclusion, there is a 5 million year old planet. Now the final inference is the following. The morning star is 5 million years old. That's the first premise. Premise 2, the evening star is a planet. Premise 3, the morning star is the evening star. So, conclusion, there is a 5 million year old planet. Now also, if it's helpful, you may substitute in these arguments the names Hesperus and Phosphorus for the evening star and the morning star, respectively. And then there will be other similar inferences which you can ask whether they are valid or not, according to Campbell.